www.1clicksoeasy.com 一 click radio， 只要一 click 就係咁簡單 ，so easy。So easy。天地有正氣啊！每個星期四，肥龍 Truman 同你講新戲數舊片。
睇戲之前就一定要聽咗天地有正氣先咯。
Hello， 各位聽眾朋友，我係肥龍啊。咁呢一個特輯呢，就係天地有正氣呢。我哋上一集呢應承咗大家係一個嘅特別訪問，就係史國同埋阿 Cindy 呢，就去到溫哥華國際電影節呢，就訪問咗兩位嘅導演嘅，包括有 Mark Street 啦，同埋 Lynn Shanks 嘅。接住落嚟嘅訪問呢，就會係全英語嘅對話嘅，咁所以如果大家嘅英語聽力 OK 嘅話呢，就一齊嚟聽聽阿 Mark 同埋阿 Lynn 嘅訪問啦。
Hi, Mark.
Hi.
How are you
Cindy.
today?
I'm doing all right, thank you.
All right, and your film is playing in about an hour. Tell us a bit about your film. What is it about, and what is it called?
Well, it's called Hasta Nunca, or See You Never. Hasta Nunca is a Spanish title, and it's about a radio DJ in Montevideo, Uruguay, who has a call-in show called Secrets and Stories, and people call in and they share their secrets, their stories, their obsessions, their neuroses with him, and he sort of plays armchair psychologist with him and responds to their sort of daily struggles.
Oh, that's very interesting. And they do it over radio live, and is all anonymous?
Anonymous, yeah. And they don't have to give their name. Some do, some don't. And some people call once, some people call back a number of times. He has sort of a rapport with a few people who call back a number of times. Some people just call once. And it's broadcast live throughout the city. One of the conceits of the film is that he's been there long enough so he can start the show and end the show whenever he wants. So he goes in at 2 in the morning, he goes in at 3 in the afternoon, and you never know when the show's going to be starting, and you never know when it's going to be ending.
Oh, cool. And so this is a documentary then?
Well, it's a little bit of both. It's a fictional construct in that I invented the characters and I invented the show. It's a documentary in the sense that it was invented. Some of the call-ins were invented by actors in Montevideo, improvised, and also the protagonist, whose name is Ruva Martinez, is an actual radio and TV personality in Montevideo. So we were able to go out into the streets and have him interview people, sort of like we're doing now. Mm-hmm. And he interviewed somebody who's homeless, and he interviewed somebody who is a gay man, and a domestic worker who was accused of stealing something. And those are real documentary moments in the film, so I sort of interspersed those among the fictional constructs of the film.
So it kind of just flows seamlessly in and out.
Yeah, it does, and there were some moments in the film that I wanted to have happen and that I took control over, and there are other moments that surprised us all. And again, it was in collaboration with people in Montevideo that, they sort of came up with these stories, and that's really what animates the film.
All right, and is everything spoken in Spanish?
It is, yeah. And Uruguayan Spanish is a very particular kind of Spanish. Oh. It's influenced by Portuguese, who were some of the colonizers of Uruguay. And also it's so close to Brazil. It has a sort of sing-songy Portuguese feel to it. So the whole thing's in Spanish.
And do you speak Spanish yourself?
I do. I had a producer from Uruguay who now lives in the United States, first in New York and then in L.A., so he was able to sort of clue and cue me into different places to film. And part of the process of making the film was a dialogue about what was idiosyncratic and what was authentic and what was worth looking at, And we enjoyed that conversation as collaborators, and hopefully that conversation is present in the film as well.
I see. So how did you come across this idea about the radio DJ?
Well, first of all, the film starts with Montevideo as place. I just really love the place. And to me, I always start with place first, and then character second, and then narrative third. And, I love the place. And I thought if there's a way I could give voice to this place, I want to do so. And to me, the radio show seemed like a way where we could literally have the airwaves beam throughout the city and have and have these stories sort of present in all these different parts of the city. So a lot of the film is just me shooting sort of documentary vignettes on the corner and then imagining how a radio show might envelop that street corner scene.
Because I'm not very familiar with the place, so are the people there really diverse? Are there a lot of different cultures there?
Yes. Well, it's a place that's been colonized, by the English first, and then the Portuguese, and then the Spanish. So architecturally and somewhat culturally, it has those strains. And then in the 19th century, like Argentina, there was a huge influx of Italian immigrants. So it's very Italian. Almost every last name you hear in Uruguay is Italian, or a lot of them are. In fact, the protagonist's name is Mario Ligeti. Italian cafes, coffee, pizza. It's very much an Italian place. Interestingly enough, we met a Korean immigrant who tried out for the film, and we loved him, and we followed him. He's a big part of the film. He was a great creator and a great collaborator, and he played a really great role as a son of an immigrant, which is different than an immigrant, a second-generation immigrant, I should say. Yeah. And we loved him. We loved the way he looked on the camera. We loved what he said. We loved his attempts to be Uruguayan and retain his Korean identity. And he became a big part of the film. And the structure of the film was such that we could bring in whatever we wanted to bring in, and we could emphasize the things we wanted to emphasize. And things that didn't work, obviously, we let go.
How long was your filming process?
I was in Uruguay a number of times beforehand, and I shot a short there, a documentary about a workshop that I taught at the Fundación de Arte Contemporáneo there, which is an artist collective. At that time, it was by the port, really great artists who were working collaboratively to talk about art and make art there in Montevideo. So I had been there a number of times, and then in terms of the film itself, I spent 10 days there casting it, and then we went back for a month and shot it for a month, and then it was a couple years of editing after that. Wow.
Did your film play in any other festivals?
Well, it played in a festival in Montevideo, Uruguay, in a beautiful old theater in which Carlos Gardel, the great tango singer, sang many, many years ago, an old dilapidated theater in downtown Montevideo. It played there as part of a festival called Festival de Cinema d'Invierno. And then it was there for 2 weeks in a theatrical run. And it played in Austin, Texas, in a festival called Cine Las Americas for Latino films. And I'm going to be in New Orleans next week with it as well.
Congratulations as well.
Thank you very much.
How did you find audience reaction? Was it any different in the two places that it played at?
Well, in Uruguay, we had a great time, and people loved it, and the gentleman stood up and said, "Thank you for breathing life into Uruguayan cinema," and we felt embraced. We did a lot of radio interviews there, and we sort of talked about radio as a medium and things like that. And we've had a good time, all in all. I think that the film brings up some strong issues about the dictatorship in Uruguay. There's a character. It touches on suicide. There's a very high suicide rate in Uruguay, and at one point we took it to an Uruguayan social club in New Jersey, and it was an unmitigated disaster. And the expatriates who were part of the Uruguayan diaspora said, "Why are you depicting my country in such a sad light?" And why didn't you go film in the mall? And there are cleaner, nicer places in Uruguay where you could have filmed. To my mind, those cleaner, nicer places had less character. But I thought it was a very interesting and somewhat painful evening in terms of perceptions of one's homeland. And interestingly enough, the people who had fled, sort of said, gee, that's not the Uruguay I remember, And the people who were still there sort of said, oh, yeah, gosh, it's so true to where I live, So that was an interesting thing as an outsider for me to come to grips with.
Okay. Thank you very much.
A pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We are here with filmmaker Lynn Sachs today during the Vancouver International Film Festival to talk about one of her recent works, Your Day is My Night, which is part of the film festival program. Hi, Lynn. How are you?
Hi. I'm really happy to be here with you.
First of all, congratulations to you and your film for being selected from at least 2,000 and more entries as part of the Vancouver International Film Festival program. And your film has also won some awards in other festivals as well.
Yes, it has.
Great. Can you tell us a little bit more about your documentary? What is it about?
Sure. So, Your Day is My Night is a hybrid documentary, which is kind of a new term, but somehow it works for what we did. Initially, it was a documentary film, but then we brought in some fictional, more performative elements. So it's about a group of 7 people who live, or in some ways pretend to live, in a shift bed house, which is a small apartment where people live sometimes on a temporary basis, a very small apartment, often with bunk beds. And it was filmed in Chinatown. And so I say it's both documentary and fiction because some of the people actually live in the house where we filmed, but other people have lived in shift bed houses at other points in their lives, or they've lived in very small quarters, or they pretend to. So it's a whole range of experiences that are expressed in the film.
So the shift bed houses, they're accommodations that are kind of shared in shifts. So someone who works in the day would sleep at night, and then someone who works at night would sleep in the day.
Yeah, that's kind of the model for it. But we didn't necessarily find that people switched that much, though we did encounter people who sometimes had to share a bed and change all of the sheets and blankets. But more likely it was for a couple of months, but some people live in a shift bed house for years. It just depends on what their relationship is to their jobs and whether they want to spend all their money on rent or just a very small part, and then they send the rest back to families that they have elsewhere.
So if you don't mind sharing, I read a little bit about the Uncle Bob story as well. So how did you become interested in the shift bed houses as an idea?
Well, actually, I would say I've been interested in the bed as a landscape and as a stage for years and years and years. I actually made a film with Mark Street, my partner, 20 years ago when we had first met in a hotel room, and I was interested in the ways that a person who lives in a hotel kind of leaves his or her mark on the bed. And I don't mean stains, I mean just the shape of your body. But then I started to think about a shared bed because my great uncle cousin Uncle Bob, had a 90th birthday, and on that day he told me about a plane wreck that happened in Brooklyn, and I was just horrified by the story that this two enormous commercial jets crashed over Staten Island, and then one of them petered along and ended up falling to the ground in the middle of a very busy area of Brooklyn, New York. So I asked my Uncle Bob on his birthday, I said, well, obviously all the people died on the plane, but what about the people on the ground? And he said to me, well, Lynn, it's hard to say because there were so many hotbed houses. And of course, I didn't know what a hotbed house was. It sounded kind of sexy or something. And I looked up hotbed house, couldn't find much on Google. Then I started to talk to people who were kind of housing experts, and they explained that that's more of a sort of slang word for a shift bed house or a shared apartment. And then I started to think about the dramas that would occur, or the struggles, as well as the joys of adults sharing a space and trying to convey their lives to one another. So that's how I first heard about the shift bed house, and then I started to kind of invent a way to learn more about it.
I come from a Chinese background, and your documentary has been very rewarding for me because I actually don't know very much about Chinatown, even the one here. I know it kind of as a brief passerby. So I'm very curious as to how you became involved with a group of Chinese performers, and when did it occur to you that to focus on like a Chinese immigrant life in New York?
Well, when I first heard about the shift bed houses, those shift bed houses were probably Italian and Irish people who worked in the ports in New York City. Specifically, they were, I think, longshoremen. So I was really interested in the beds. That was the impetus. And then when I did the research, as a real documentarian does, you try to find, you're interested in a subject, so you try to find out as much as you can and you immerse yourself. So the more I found out about current shift bed houses, the more I found out that they existed in Chinatown. In fact, there were shift bed houses at the turn of the century between the 19th and 20th century that had been photographed by a very, very famous documentary photographer named Jacob Riis. And he took pictures of shift bed houses that were inhabited by Jewish families, Irish families, Italian families, not really Chinese families at that point. So that kind of house, which is also often called a tenement house, has existed in New York for a long time. But currently in New York's Chinatown, you actually find a lot of these houses. And I thought I would just kind of knock on the door and find some people who would talk to me. Or I wasn't that naive, but I was determined. That didn't work out. I spent maybe 6 months doing that, trying to get my foot in the door. But when that failed, I realized that failure would have to take me in another direction artistically. So then I thought I would invent the whole thing and I would create a shift bed house. But the actors I found weren't very interesting because they didn't want to improvise. And they had no experiences whatsoever that in common with what I was trying to explore. So then I had to go to Plan C, and Plan C was to find some people from Chinatown, because I knew there were shift bed houses, who would perform the story. And I went to a community center in Chinatown called the Linsing Association, and there I found a lot of people, mostly seniors, who were willing to be in the film because they auditioned for the film. And after the audition, or during the audition, I should say, which wasn't really a traditional audition, it was more like a series of interviews, I heard all of these extraordinarily tragic stories about what these older Chinese people had experienced during the 40s, 50s, 60s in China during the Cultural Revolution. So then I thought, my film about shift bed houses will also be a context by which I can explore these histories.
Did you find it difficult for your characters to open up to you or to the camera?
A lot of people ask me that because they say sometimes it's hard to get Chinese people who don't speak English talking to an American woman who doesn't speak Chinese. It appears that there would be a lot of obstacles to our communication. I think what happened was that I started the questioning with something that was very accessible, and it wasn't about drawing out tragedy. It was about allowing for those struggles to show themselves. So when I asked simply, could you tell me anything interesting that happened to you at some point in your life on a bed? I heard from one person about having his family attacked in northern China, and that everything was stolen from his house except for his stone bed, which was too heavy. Or I heard, that was from Mr. Che. And then I heard from Mr. Huang, who talked about coming to the United States and living on a little teeny mattress or maybe just some blankets in a closet. So that was his bed. So they were actually extremely creative in drawing from their own personal experiences.
Because it's very easy for Chinese phrases or like ways of saying things in Chinese to kind of get lost in translation. So how did you
That is a great
overcome the
question.
language barrier?
So what we did was I did the initial interviews with a Zoom recorder, like you have, in all audio. And they were about maybe 45 minutes long. And then I had those translated by Catherine Ng, who's here with us today. And she understands Mandarin and Cantonese. So she would sit there and she would listen to it and we would translate it. And then I worked with a playwright, and we took the English translations, which were very long and went in a lot of different directions, and then we distilled those conversations to monologues that were very precise, that only worked with the experiences around the beds, and that wove in the sort of struggles and tragic moments that came with those beds. So that what ended up happening was I had 6 stories that had a similar theme, but they drew from very different experiences, but the same time frame, the same difficulties that came from being in China during those periods that were very repressed.
And did you find it difficult at all trying to weave the different stories together?
Yeah, that's why editing a film like this always takes a long time. I wanted to go back to that question that you brought up about Chinese expressions. So Catherine really helped me with the translations, but I also brought in another Mandarin-speaking film editor who could work with me, who knew Final Cut Pro, the editing system, and his name's Brian Chang. And he could go through all the translations we did, which were quite literal, and actually move them from being word for word literal translations into English, because English is now his main language, but he speaks Chinese.
Right.
And he could take a Chinese expression and bring in the parallel English expression so that it would have that resonance. And if he didn't know what to do, he would call his father, and we would play the recording from the speaker over the phone, and his father helped us. So that process was really, really important.
Wow.
So there were like 3 levels, and at one point Catherine's son came in and helped us. So everybody brought a different expertise.
And get different angles and
Yeah.
layers into the film. I thought the moments where the young Puerto Rican woman,
Lourdes.
right. I thought the moments that she was in the film, I thought they were really sweet. When she was visiting at the sculptures, and then they were eating at the restaurant.
Oh, good.
I thought they were really sweet. And then at the end where she was talking on the bridge, I think it was. Yeah. I felt like she added a different dynamic to the film. But then I understand she's also played by an actress.
Yeah, she's the
based
only
on a character.
the actual actress. I really wanted to bring a kind of live wire, a catalyst, something that would charge the moment and that would bring an outsider into this community, and the outsider would be confused and out of place in the way that. So she's almost an immigrant from the English-speaking and Spanish-speaking larger majority in New York. She becomes a minority living in this Chinese community. She moves into the house. Right. She's younger too, so she's different generationally. She's also different culturally, and I liked her sense of confusion, which was real, and we improvised with that. And also what happened was, by bringing her in, that kind of activated the Chinese-speaking performers to play with it. They got to be really inventive, and they would say things to this woman who was supposedly moving into their apartment, like, take your shoes off, because that is not a traditional thing to do in American society, let alone Puerto Rican society, but it is in a Chinese home. So there were a lot of funny things. And then actually, when we were shooting the material, and everything was going on in Chinese and Spanish, and I understand Spanish but not Chinese, I actually didn't realize till 3 months later, when I had the translation completely done, it took a long time, that one of my older Chinese performers, Suet Li Hing, she says something like, "What's that Westerner doing moving into my house?" That was her idea. And people laugh at it, but we didn't know it was there. We were editing with the material before we even realized it.
Right.
So a lot of little surprises came out because they were so creative in what they would say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Little things like, oh, wash your hands,
Wash
like the
your-
moment
yeah.
she came in. Yeah.
But I'm glad you liked that because it was a little risk. The more obvious way to make this film would be just to open up a window, so to, like the sort of mythic window of documentary, open up the curtain and look in. But I wanted to change that and to allow the performers to be creative, sort of theatrically and cinematically, and bringing her in allowed us to do that. I wanted to say one more thing about that section you asked me about, in which they go to visit some sculptures, because actually it's the most political part of the whole film.
Right.
Do you want me to talk about that?
for
And
sure.
I knew that there was an Ai Weiwei sculpture, temporary sculpture, a very large one, in a very central part of New York City. So I thought it would be interesting to take part of the film away from Chinatown and to go to Midtown, where older Chinese people, the performers in the film, might feel less at ease than we would in China. I liked the different moments where people feel comfortable and then they don't feel comfortable. So, but when I explained to them we were going to go see an Ai Weiwei sculpture, one of the performers in the film, Mr. Huang, asked me about Ai Weiwei, and he didn't actually know much about him, but I explained that he was a critic of the Chinese government and that the Chinese government really did not approve of him at all. So Mr. Huang chose not to go. He was nervous about it and didn't go. So we wove that into the story of the film, that reluctance to be somewhere that was so charged politically.
Right. And leading back to all the kind of layers and the translations in the film, so what are some of the more prominent themes or elements or layers of the film that you really want the audience to take away with?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I guess one of the things I'm really interested in is the way that, for the most part, even in a big city, that there are these very separate communities that somehow can live in isolation, that we pass each other by so often, but because we come from different cultures, we are just faces to each other, and like attracts like, and that happens all the time. And so something happens in a film, and that is that each person involved in the film kind of issues his or her own license to be a little more liberated. And so one of the things that happened in this film is that, for me personally, I got to interact with a group of people who have extremely different backgrounds from mine. And there was, in some ways, like a wall between us, which is the language. And the wall is very thick. But through the act of doing something creative together, we all were so committed that the wall started to break down. And because we had people like Catherine Ng, Jennifer Lee, Leslie Keep, I can't pronounce her name. She's a new translator that's been working with us. Because of their comfort in both places,
Right.
which is really special, that created this whole flow. So, for example, now whenever I walk around with Suet Hing Lee, she always wants to hold my hand. And to me, that is part of the affection and comfort that we've both developed, because I don't know how many people she knows who don't speak Chinese, and I certainly don't know people who only speak Chinese, and now it doesn't matter. But we do always have to have a translator, even for a telephone call.
Even for a telephone call.
Particularly for a telephone call.
So what were some of the audience's reactions to some of the screenings you've been to?
Oh, yeah, that's now I can actually speak to that. So there's a whole range. There's been a lot of younger Chinese people who maybe were born in Chinese-speaking people who were born in Taiwan, people who were born in mainland China, but they live in Toronto, for example, or they live in New York City. We've shown it in Mexico and Buenos Aires. There weren't that many Chinese people in Buenos Aires watching the film, but one of the things that they've observed is that the lifestyle at least in New York's Chinatown, which is very busy, really thriving, very culturally rich, is a lifestyle that doesn't exist that much in China anymore. That it sort of touches on a life that was part of the maybe 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, but in their minds it's almost frozen. Like the cultural, for example, the cultural activity of sitting at a table and breaking peanuts together,
Right.
and gossiping.
Right. Yeah.
Someone in Toronto told me that, I don't know for sure, the word for breaking peanuts, sitting and doing that, is also the word for to gossip. Maybe I'm wrong, but he remembered hearing it from his grandmother. But that doesn't have any meaning to him anymore.
Right.
So that, a little bit of that nostalgia, or sort of like a living history, that was something I learned from my audience in many places. Another thing I've learned is that there are people who feel very strong opinions about someone moving to a country and not learning the language.
Right.
I don't feel this way, but sometimes people say, even in an audience, and they say it publicly, I don't understand why you don't speak English. And Mr. Sui, one of our performers, said very eloquently, you don't understand how many hours I had to work from the day I set foot in this country until I retired. I worked so many hours I didn't have time to go to classes. And if you came here in the 60s and 70s, there probably weren't that many classes.
Yeah. No.
And it was hard for a Chinese-speaking person to learn English when he was living with Chinese people and working with them. So he wasn't defensive. He was just candid. So that issue around language, another woman, just a couple of days ago, a Chinese woman who'd only been in New York for about a month. She was a
Very
student
new.
at NYU. Yeah. She said, well, if it's so hard in New York, why don't you go back to China? She raised her hand and said that. And they all said, well, my life is here. I go back to China, but now I'm a visitor.
It's different. I remember for Mr. Huang, he couldn't go back to China.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's pretty honest about that in the film because of his documents. But I personally don't want to speak about their paperwork. But he talks about it, honestly. So he's working on getting the right visas and cards so that he could go back. And he has children he hasn't seen in decades.
Yeah. Which he also mentioned
Yeah,
in the
he
film.
does. That's really a tragedy.
Yeah. Are your previous works also similar that you would incorporate fictional elements and...
I've only made one other film that uses documentary and fiction, and it was probably more fiction and brought in a little documentary. But I really like this model of working. I really like that it makes people that you would call cast or you would call subjects. In narrative, you'd say the cast.
Yeah.
In documentary, people say subjects. And now I can say collaborators. So I like that, the surprises that happen with that and the kind of community of creative spirits that happens. So I think my next film will probably use that model again. I want to keep going with it.
Any ideas for any future?
Yeah, I do have a new idea. Do you want to hear it?
Yeah, a little bit.
I'll just say briefly.
Yeah.
So I'm 52, and I want to find 6 other people who live in New York who come from different parts of the world who are exactly my age. And I want to work with them and kind of create kind of like a performative history of the second half of the 20th century through each year, but with the idea it's almost like a cubist painting where you have a portrait of one person, but it's really 6 people, but they each had all different experiences. So if you say 1968, for example, that was a very important year in the United States, and there was the civil rights movement, and I want to focus on the micro experiences. Like, for example, there were curfews in the city where I grew up in Memphis in 68. So I have really vivid memories of the darkness and not being able to go out at night. But someone else might remember, growing up in China in 68 would have been completely different. So I'm not asking people to just recount political events. It's like the small events of their lives. So that's something I want to do.
That's great. It would be a bit more personal as well.
Very personal, because last year I started a project where I wrote a poem for every year of my life. So it's kind of like asking these other people who I have not found to write a poem for every year of their lives. But the idea is that it's about the intersection of the public and the private moment.
And finally, what are some of the other festivals that Your Days My Night will be part of or was part of?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Well, the film premiered at the Museum of Modern Art it's called the Documentary Fortnight. It's a film festival in February. We showed it at the Traverse City Film Festival, which is run by Michael Moore. Yeah. And actually, Michael Moore gave it an award as Best Experimental Film, so I got to meet him. That was really
Congratulations.
exciting. Yeah. It showed at a film festival called the Workers Unite Film Festival. It was actually opening night there. And I told the people at the film festival that there's actually no work in my film. It's all about everything but work. Yeah. And they said, yeah, but all of those people were workers, so we want to look at how workers live when they're not in the office or at the factory.
Kind of more an intimate side of working.
So it won Best Narrative there. At the Athens Film Festival, not Athens, Greece, it's Athens, Ohio, but it's a really great film festival. It won second prize for the documentary feature. And then most recently, it won first prize for feature film at the San Diego Asian Film Festival.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thanks. It was great to talk to you.
www.1clicksoeasy.com 一 click radio 只要一 click 就係咁簡單 ，so easy。